And today I'm here with Paul Marshall and Richard Earl. So I wanted to do a quick introduction here. Videos are on, perfect. So Paul is from a company, Eseye, that does actually IoT implementations since quite a while. And Paul is the co-founder of that company. And fun fact is that Paul and I sort of know us since many, many years when the Zigbee Alliance started over 20 years ago now. So it's been quite a while since this is all going on. And as they always say, you know, you have to have the right technology, but also at the right time and for the right purpose, right? So I think we're seeing more and more of that being really important here. And Richard comes from a different space, really, although these days everything is interconnected for sure. But Richard is the R&D director at EO Charging and has been also working for over 20 years in energy and automotive sectors in various roles, right? And EO Charging, I think, focuses on fleet electrification. So it's, I think, something we haven't had yet today, if I recall correctly. So that's really good to see. And I mean, they have big customers, big clients such as like Amazon, Tesco, Go Ahead, and so on. And so Richard has been doing a lot of the R&D in that space for the last 6+ years there. So good to have everybody here on the call. Welcome, Paul and Richard.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to
Very
speak.
good. Maybe actually, I almost forgot. Yeah, myself, I'm Rolf Bienert. I'm the managing and technical director of the OpenADR Alliance, where we manage the OpenADR standard, a connectivity protocol between a DSO or utility or any kind of demand response flexibility program operator down to the customer equipment, like for instance, a IoT gateway or an EV charging management system. If you need more information, just of course ping me later on. So I wanted to hop right in here, and I think it's great that we have these two panelists because you know, we all know and we have heard a lot about it already this morning that electric vehicles are certainly, you know, gonna be there one way or the other. I was just at a conference in Germany, and then of course people talk about these headlines that say EV sales is not doing well and so on, and it's going down, and oh no, what's going to happen? But really, if you look at it, like always, right? We see market predictions that are almost skyrocketing, you know, exponential growth and things like that. You know, we all know about how the stock market works and things like that. So these predictions are there, and then oh no, you know, if it doesn't you know, develop quite like that, it's a big problem. But we see that EV sales is still there, is still good, is still going up. And we'll continue to see that, of course, you know, in particular with regulations in place in some countries, states, and areas where, you know, they want to move to 100% electric vehicle sales very, very soon. So it will come, but it's not without challenges. Energy usage, customer experience, integrating all the different technologies and so on come to mind here. And of course, from my end, I come from the standardization side, right? Proprietary systems from the plugs to communication protocols, you know, could be a bit of a problem here. So again, you know, we have here two different business fields. So I wanted to kick this off by asking the panelists individually, like, what is the #1 hurdle that you see coming from your end of the business? So maybe, you know, just because that's the top of my list here on Zoom, I start with Paul. What do you feel like in your business is the hurdle for the acceleration to the transition to electric vehicles?
I think the biggest hurdle probably is so in inertia and where people are looking to say the classic things that people are worried about in an electric vehicle. Will I be able to charge it and will it be charged? And I think that's both applies to consumers who can say, will I be able to get up in the morning and use my vehicle because it's charged? But also to larger fleets. And Richard, you probably got more comments on this than I have. But larger fleets saying, if I cannot use my fleet tomorrow morning, what will happen to my business? And therefore, it comes down to reliability. And I think we're going to talk about lots of reliability aspects of this in the next few minutes.
And just to quickly ask there, so reliability, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to that, right? So are you thinking more on the communications, on the system, or the grid in general?
Well, I suppose from my point of view, a lot of it is about communications, which is we supply connectivity for devices, IoT devices. Our business is in getting those, as close to 100% connection as we can. And EVs, so whether it's individuals, consumers, or fleets, this really matters because it allows us to do the management and the control. But I think it's a bigger picture because I think it's everything from the ability to control and manage to the ability to deliver the power that people are expecting over a period of time when they're not in attendance and not monitoring it themselves necessarily.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah. Richard, what do you think?
I don't think there is one issue, one key standout point. I think there's multiple. We have to remember we're moving from a once in a lifetime ecosystem change. At the start of this millennium, we had petrol stations, internal combustion engines, diesel. We've got a massive infrastructure across the globe maintaining that ecosystem. And now what we're doing is we're transitioning away from that ecosystem to an entirely new, different ecosystem, one which is dependent on an entirely new set of power sources, an entirely new delivery model, an entirely new set of components. So across the entire ecosystem of EVs, we've got to make sure that everything works. So the power generation, the distribution, the connections to the sites, the operation of the infrastructure, the communications of the infrastructure back to the controlling software. We've got the availability of the vehicles, we've got reliability of the vehicles, and making sure that this entire new ecosystem works. And so, if you look at it in that context, we've got a massive job to do, and we're a massive, but the good news is we're a long way through that process. And what we're now doing is we're sort of we're uncovering all of the scenarios that we weren't expected, like, what was the public backlash to EVs? How do we address those? How do we ensure that the grid connections are done in a timely manner? How do we ensure that we've got enough semiconductors into the vehicles to ensure that the vehicles can be delivered to the customers when they wanted them? So I don't think it's possible to identify a single hurdle at this stage, but it's really the culmination of many different hurdles and which ones are the most pressing ones at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're making a really good point about also the customer experience in a way, right? Where we really, as an industry, probably have to work more on, making fine adjustments or transition also customer expectations, right? It is always easy, right? If you have easy access to the energy when you go to the gas station quickly, you can do this last minute. You can very, very easily, without any planning, do trips and things like that, right? And now all of a sudden there needs to be a little bit of planning and other things, and maybe we can convince some customers also that they don't need a huge car, right? But rather something that's more appropriate or for the city and things like that. So there must be, I guess, some adjustment here in the overall idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think over the last couple of years, so I've been working for EO Charging for 6 years, and at the start it was all very much about the tech. Customers were very interested, the early adopters, and they were interested in how the car talked to the charger and the charger talked to the cloud. Whereas now we're looking at our dealings with our major customers, the big bus operators and the fleet deliveries. And frankly, at a high level, they don't really care about electrification. They don't care about the fact that whether they're pulling this amount of power or not. What they worry about is, can they get their customers from A to B, or can they get their parcels from A to B? And for them, at a very high level, that's really what they're after. And so therefore, yes, at certain layers, there are fleet managers who are very worried about whether the electricity is working. But we as a fleet provider, we have to provide that assurance to our customers that 9 o'clock in the morning, your fleet is good, it's ready, it's charged, and it's off you go. And that's what we've got to get to. We've got to get to that point where we can say to our customers, yeah, thumbs up, you're good to go. And
I think that's really important. I mean, the way you put that is what really matters to people, which is when they're coming to use the car, is it in a position? And you were talking about moving from filling cars up with diesel or petrol, where actually if you were doing that, it took you a few minutes and you knew you'd been successful. We're now talking about charging a vehicle which takes multiple hours, and you need to know that it's going to be successful during those hours. And I think you make a really good point there.
Yeah, and then of course people are always resisting to change to some extent, even though they want variety, right? A simple example, I lived in the US for over 20 years, and while I was there at the grocery stores, and it's a kind of a very simple example, but still it applies, right? You saw where when I moved there, you would still get all the groceries bagged, in an unlimited amount of plastic bags, right? So at the checkout line, and then over the years, it was less and less the case. You either had to pay for the bags, right, or you bring your own, and then some shops don't even offer some, and it's a little change, right? But for the customer, like you said already, they just need to get their groceries home. So there needs to be an adjustment here on how they do that, right? So yeah, that makes all total sense. So maybe that actually leads me into a bit of a different discussion here. So maybe I'll start here on that with Paul. And I have to admit that I'm a little bit of an IoT solution, let's call it critic to some extent, because I always like to say that if you have like 6 different IoT apps on your mobile device to control different things, for me, this is just a very expensive remote control. So I would like to see much more connection between the systems. And I think we are starting to see that. There's, on one hand, companies that do this connecting, if you will, also for the energy side of things. But Paul, maybe you have much more insight into that. So how does the electrification of the transport side of things fit in with what we already have in IoT, and are you also developing specifically new things from your end for that, or how does that fit?
I think that's a really interesting analogy you started with there. So you were talking about using an app on your phone as an expensive remote control, if you like, for doing something. And I think that's a way that people, consumers can get engaged with it, because they end up with, I'll call it smart devices in their houses. Right. But often they become disillusioned with those very quickly, because, as you say, it's a smart remote control, or it's an expensive remote control, but it's not really adding any benefit to you other than it's a toy. And I think when we're talking about electrification of vehicles, we're actually changing the narrative here. And we're not talking about whether you want to be able to necessarily see the state of charge of your vehicle, although obviously that might be important to you. But actually, we're talking about your influence and your effect on the rest of the world. And this, I think, is where IoT really kicks in and really adds the huge value. Because if you have got somebody who is, for example, charging a large fleet or charging their individual vehicle in a road where there is limited capacity to deliver that power, then the supplier of that power needs to be able to balance that. And whether that's sequencing the load, or asking changing people to do things early or later, or actually just slowing everything down. But the supplier of the power needs to be able to do that so that they can manage their infrastructure. And that's where IoT comes in, because you need somebody who's looking at that and controlling it. Now, what I don't know is how that might pan out in the marketplace, because it could pan out with dynamic pricing, which is actually where you end up with dynamic pricing, and consumers will have different appetites for how they control that. And then we might see new players in the market, people who are actually looking to say, I'm going to understand your dynamic pricing, and I'm going to manage the control of you charging your vehicle to balance those out. Or it might even be that the suppliers, the electricity suppliers themselves, will have to start looking and saying, actually, if you want me to supply you with this service, then I will need to be able to control it, and therefore I will need connections. I suppose it comes back to me beating the drums I started with, which is reliability, which is saying, actually, you need to know that your vehicle is going to be charged when you want to charge it. So you have to be able to tell the supplier who is controlling it, whether that's somebody you've employed or something the electricity company's employed, but you have to be able to say, this is my requirement for using the vehicle. Now, please manage the charging to meet my requirement. But also the supplier needs to know that the connection to the device is reliable, because they need to be able to say, I need to do some load shedding now. I need to balance the network.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because if you're going to move away from my expensive remote control just being a toy to actually being something that's useful and sticky, you've got to add value. And I think the value for the customer is the fact that they are going to be able to charge their vehicles as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Now, that might, there will be scenarios where they just have to charge now, but 90% of the time they want to be able to charge when the tariff is cheap, or they may want to go when I've got solar, or when I've got there is a high green energy on the grid at the moment. So it's adding that value to the customer that makes this sort of the IoT side of life really sticky and valuable.
I think that's where standards are really going to start kicking in as well, because actually the examples you gave there, if you've got dynamic pricing from your supplier and you've got solar, then you've got multiple potential sources for charging the car, and you have to be able to have something which will bring those together and make a decision on when you next need to use the vehicle.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in the market now. It's, the first sort of phase has been, right, let's get a charger in the ground, let's charge a vehicle. The second phase is, right, how do I balance battery? How do I balance solar? How do I balance grid signals? And to provide what customer A wants, because that might be very different to what customer B wants. And I think that whole evolution of the smart charging ecosystem is going to be really key and interesting over the next few years. And I think it's, it goes back to that sort of first statement of what's the biggest hurdle? Well, there isn't one. There's many different hurdles all over the place.
That makes sense. And I mean, of course, I was a little, on purpose, I was a little controversial there with my expensive remote control. But I think it does make sense. But we do, of course, and I acknowledge that totally, that we do now see more connectivity happening, right? Payment systems, right? So you can pay across different systems and manage cost potentially and things like that. So I'm assuming that this is also something you guys work on, right? The whole like, how do I pay for charging if I'm outside the house, right? Versus when I'm at home and such.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Paul, you go.
Okay, I'll start. I think the whole charging probably splits into two parts, which is if I call it destination charging, which is where you're inside the home, you're taking a long-term charger. It still needs to be paid for in some way, but typically you've got the en route charging when you're halfway through a journey, at which point you're looking for a much quicker, immediate solution. But yes, you need to be able to identify yourself to be able to pay, and therefore you're looking to say, does every single charger that I come up with, rather than traditionally you might go into the kiosk at a garage to pay for the fuel that you've just put in your car, you're now saying I've got 50, 100 chargers in a car park on the motorway services. I need to identify myself to that particular charger and pay for the electricity that I've consumed from there. And therefore, yes, we are looking at contactless and other smart ways of making that payment.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about payments, there's two parts to it. There's the authentication of like, is this person allowed to charge on this charger? And then B, there's the sending of the, working out how much energy they consume, their financial bill, and then sending that through the process, through the payment process. And what we're finding with our certainly our larger fleets they're beginning to explore all options now. So therefore, they might have 100 chargers on a site, and they might have 5 in a car in the employee car park. So in the employee car park, they will go, right, okay, let's make those essentially public chargers, and any employee can drive up, tap a credit card, and off they go. They then have a middle mile partner who they allow to charge on their other 95 depot charges. So yeah, they might go, well, actually, these 10 charges over here are for our middle mile people. Therefore, they have to use an RFID card, and therefore they have to then get a separate invoicing system, a separate bill at the end of the month. And then the other 90, they might then just be free vending for their own depot vehicles when they go out to do deliveries. So we're seeing this multi-use scenarios now. And we're also beginning to see sort of, the traditional model of charging is like you come in at 5 o'clock, plug in, charge overnight. Companies are beginning to see, well, actually, okay, well, how can I sweat my asset during the day? I've paid a lot of money for this equipment. How can I use it in the day? So therefore, can I strike up a deal with my local taxi firm so they can use the chargers during the day? So it all comes down to then, the authentication and the invoicing systems associated with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, maybe Richard, to stick with your infrastructure and so on. I mean, do you see some specific activities that the charging infrastructure industry, if you will, and I mean, this is a brand new industry, if you will, right? I mean, sure, it's around 10 years, but that's still very new for something like this. But is there something that the industry there on that end can contribute to really accelerate the transition?
So I think it's really working in partnership. Yeah, now that can be partnership with the customers, it can be partnership with investors, it can be partnerships with councils and governments, and it's really trying to straddle all of those stakeholders to ensure that we are accelerating and delivering the infrastructure as required. So, for example, if we were a public CPO, we would be working with the local governments to find the right sites. We would be making sure we're working with the investors to make sure we've got the investment, the long-term 15-year investment plan to install this infrastructure and pay it back. But within a sort of a fleet environment, there's a couple of things we're trying to do to accelerate. One of them is the sort of making these large fleets have a large electricity consumption. And so therefore they often have a much greater demand than they have current capability. So for example, they might have a 100 amp fuse, but actually what they really need is a 500 amp fuse. So therefore what we've developed is a sort of a suite of load management controls that allow the customers to get more chargers on site than their current grid capacity allows. So therefore we can distribute the available power across all the connected vehicles and really sweat that grid connection to make sure that we're maximizing that and putting that into the vehicles as quickly as possible. And then we can do that whilst working with the local grid, the local distribution networks to say, well, actually, we need, this site has a grid connection of 1 megawatt, but in 2 years' time we need a 2 megawatt connection. So therefore, let's get the planning in now. Let's do the acceleration, and it's working with our customers. And then there's the sort of the funny scenarios where we've got one customer in London who has a big bus depot, and they've got a 1 megawatt connection. And at the moment, what they do is they have to share that with the local rugby ground. So therefore, on a Tuesday night, when they've got a rugby match, the lights come on the rugby stadium. And so therefore, the amount of power available to the customer is reduced. And that's part of their grid connection sort of contract. So therefore, what we have to do is we have to front load the charging on Saturday and Monday nights, not do much charging on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we can then top up again. But whilst we've got that, the ability to sort of schedule it, we've also got to make sure that all the vehicles are there present and fully charging and, really sweating that asset. And I think that is really where the infrastructure can come in, is A, work with the customers and the councils and the operators to make sure we've got the right capacity in the right places. But then B, secondly, making sure that the grid connections we have at the moment, they're fully sweated and that we're maximizing them to the best of our abilities.
I mean, I think that's where the IoT part comes in as well, which is actually within that depot or within that rugby ground, they know what their demands are, and there's also some future prediction available on that. But that needs to be communicated back into something which can control the parts of the grid that are flexible. So you're charging your buses is flexible, running the lights is not flexible. They've got to be on when the game's being played. And I think those are the kind of things where actually getting those connections back, understanding the protocols, and getting the negotiation between those different diverse systems in that case really matters.
Absolutely. And I think, at the moment we've got, specifically IoT, we've got IoT charging stations connecting to on-site hub controllers, which are then connecting to cloud-based systems, which are then connecting to grid management systems. And so each of those is a device, it's an IoT device. And then there's a protocol in between. So as long as the sort of the protocols are fully defined and fully sort of respected, then that's how you begin to build up that system. And that touches both on your world, Paul, and Rolf, in your OpenADR world. Yeah,
and I mean, speaking of sort of these issues with having enough power, like you say, with the rugby stadium and stuff like that, I mean that of course opens another question here about vehicle to grid and vehicle to home feed in. I mean, we have talked about that for a long time, and I know that in particular in fleets, actually, we have seen, I believe in the US, a number of trials, particular like fleets that consist of, for instance, school buses, right? School buses really run twice a day, and in between, for the most part, except for some extra transport, they often sit around, right? So there's a huge amount of capacity available in these batteries to potentially run stuff, but also to the home. As I mentioned in the beginning, I attended a vehicle to grid conference in Germany a few weeks ago, and it was interesting to see that now there are slowly coming a number of use cases for this, or I should also say cars. I believe Renault is making one, and there's a few others that have now feed-in chargers as well. But we haven't really seen it, taking a hold also of the utilities and so on. What is your experience with that? Do you see this coming? Maybe I start with Richard here on this one because of the fleet and almost like virtual power plant kind of scenario.
So it is definitely coming. We're seeing lots more activity from vehicle OEMs and charging manufacturers on this topic. I think part of the problem has been the slow release of the relevant standards. So the 15.11.8 standard has been delayed, and it took a while to get into the market. But we're now seeing the vehicles come to market with the right technology. I don't think it's going to be the silver bullet for everything. I don't think it's going to be for every customer, but it will certainly have a significant place in the market. And the reason I say that is, for some in the UK, the peak electricity is sort of like early mornings and the evening times. And if you're a bus operator, you've got vehicles out servicing that market. So therefore, they won't have the vehicles in the depot in order to facilitate vehicles grid. But if you're a homeowner, you may be able to, to make use of it. And I was speaking to one manufacturer, and they make high-end vehicles, and so therefore where customers may drive them 5-10 days in a year. And in that scenario, well, why can't they plug it in for the rest of the other 350 days of the year and turn it into a virtual power plant and make it their static home battery and really sign up to the grid services? So I think the technology is going to be there. It's going to be really cool, and it's going to really solve a lot of problems for a lot of people, but it won't be for everyone.
Now, I think it's an interesting extension because we're now starting to see home batteries, aren't we? Which is where and so, again, some supply companies are offering to manage those batteries remotely. So effectively, they're using local storage rather than having, a distributed power plant. And I think that's going to be really valuable when we're looking at, for example, sudden demands on the grid, where the operator sees the frequency of the grid suddenly start to fall. For example, I can remember a few years ago, there was a sudden drop in wind and the frequency on the grid dropped. Now, to be able to immediately, and again, we come back to my business, which is reliable connections, but to be able to immediately identify that that's happening and then kick in a small amount, a significant amount of power for a very short time to allow the recovery to take place, I think is going to be really important, particularly in allowing people, again, we talk about balancing the grid, we talk about where does investment need to be, rather than the electricity company having to invest in large plants or infrastructure to be able to deliver against those spikes. Actually, they can distribute that and just pull that little bit from the vehicles that are plugged in at the time.
And I think that the evolution of the, certainly if you look in a domestic environment, the evolution of the smart home is going to be really interesting. How is the vehicle going to talk to the charger? How's the charger going to talk to the smart meter, to the battery, to the solar? How's it going to relate to the grid flexibility services? All of that is under discussion at the moment. And that's a really interesting domain. And I think that will create some really cool use cases and, things we haven't thought of today, but that will really make a real difference to a lot of people. How do I put my house into island mode? How do I put my, to make sure that my battery and my vehicle acts as my home energy battery, and things like that. So it is going to be a very exciting few years as we begin to unlock the capabilities that we just haven't even thought about today.
I think the vehicle to home is really where I also noticed at this conference that there is an emphasis there, because obviously you get around regulations and things like that, right? You don't have to do any kind of feed in and such. And to be honest, I'm even, for me personally, I'm kind of thinking, okay, if I get another EV, I would want one that could do vehicle to home, because I have a small battery in the house, I have solar on the roof. So I could easily kind of make this work, also working from home for the most time. So, you can charge during the day, and I could use that more efficiently at night. But anyhow, I wanted to keep a few minutes here open for questions from the audience. So Jordan, I guess I give it back to you to moderate the questions.
Yeah, we've had 2 questions from the audience. On the grid balancing front, we've seen the industry discuss vehicle to grid for a long time, but the uptake from both manufacturers and energy companies is slow. Octopus Energy, for example, offers free charging if you enable vehicle to grid, but only on a Nissan Leaf, a Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid, and a Nissan van. You also have to have a specific charger. Given the barriers of entry and the constant promise of V2G, but no real delivery, has the technology been overhyped?
Yeah, I think we talked about that a little bit already. Maybe Paul and Richard can comment a little more on that. But from my perspective, I think it's as I mentioned early on, right? We have to have a good technology, but it has to be at the right time for the right reason. Right. And I think we are getting to that point. I think maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was still a bit early, for the consumers to really understand it, what it means, even for the grid operator to really become clear to them how it could help them. Because traditionally, right, if you go 20 years back, most utilities would say, I want to sell my power for money, period. Right. So there was not really a lot of discussion on grid balancing and things like that, but we are certainly getting there, right? And I see that with like OpenADR based programs that are popping up in different areas. But anyways, Richard and Paul, I don't know if you want to add a little bit to that.
Very succinctly, I would say that the technology has not been overhyped, but I think the schedule has been a bit unrealistic.
That's probably true. I think that it could be really exciting as well, because actually there are some novel really applications, and I think we're going to come back to early adopters who are probably going to be excited by the technology and saying, how can I use this, and experimenting with it and using it. But then the real benefits will come in the next generation or the next wave of people adopting it, where there are tools in place to allow the people who get the benefit from being able to use vehicle to grid are actually able to get that in the hands of consumers.
Yeah, I think we are, because it's been spoken about for so long. People seem to assume the technology that we speak about is available now, but it's something that's been very in the theoretical stage, I would say, and then it's now coming more into the main stage. Even UK Power Networks has spoken about how potentially we could transform airport car parks into great, almost like demand side response batteries, I guess. So yeah, it's definitely, I agree with you guys in terms of it's definitely coming. The next question from an audience member is, what advice or suggestion would you give to businesses trying to pull together an achievable roadmap for fleet electrification?
Sounds like a perfect question for Richard there.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think the key thing is planning. You need to understand, you need to work with someone who's been there and gone through the system before many times, and together with that partner work out what is the plan, because you need to look at what your business is it delivering people, is it delivering parcels, is it doing some, is it just employee parking? And you need to work out what your dwell time is for the vehicles, how many vehicles do you think you'll need, how much energy do you think you're going to need, and then once you've done that initial sort of business model of what you're going to do, then you can begin to do the next stages of doing, infrastructure planning, uptime, service management. Do you need a 24/7 support? Do you need 99% uptime, which we can provide? Do you need equipment, or actually are you just employing sort of 4 people who park outside during the day? So it really depends on the requirements, and you need, work with a partner who's gone through that before and can help you through that guidance process, because it is tricky getting all the grid connections up and running, getting the planning, getting the availability of the vehicles. It all takes time, and it's not easy.
No, and
I
you
think
yeah,
so I think my interest on that, I think, comes after that, because I think the planning is so important in getting it right, because actually you're talking about a substantial investment in infrastructure. But I think where I get interested is saying, after that's done, how is it being monitored to make sure that it's delivering what you need it to deliver, that you have scaled it correctly, and actually as businesses grow, people will be looking to increase the load on it. It's very easy for that to be a creep. Whatever the planning has gone into it. And I think monitoring it, and also the control as well. I think once it's installed, knowing that there is an ability to be able to control how that's being used really matters.
And to some of our customers, that's a really key point, Paul, because their electrification of their fleet is business critical, and so business critical infrastructure requires reliable networks, reliable protocols. It requires the 24/7 support services. And all of those things are critical to the business. So it depends. As you say, it goes back to the original requirements.
You were talking about a fleet of buses. If the drivers will turn up in the morning and the buses aren't charged, that is.
Oh, we know about it.
Well, I hope you don't. But actually, that's the that is so important that does not happen, and that actually the monitor is in place. And if there is an unexpected event, maybe from a third party, which means that you're not getting power to the site or whatever, actually somebody needs to know about that so they have time to take remediation. And I think getting that information in the right hands is at the right time is really important.
Yeah, I guess like you said it perfectly earlier in terms of the anecdote about the rugby ground, in terms of you can't take a generic approach and be like, this is what you do for all sites. It has to be on a case-by-case basis and addressing specific needs. But also you have that amazing plan to begin with, but plans change. So it is good to have both sides of it, planning and the constant monitoring. That was the final question from the audience. Is there anything else that you guys want to add? Rolf, can't hear you.
You're on mute, Rolf.
Oops, okay, got it. Yeah, from my end, just want to thank Paul and Richard here, and of course, Powered On for the opportunity. It was a good discussion, and I'm sure we'll have quite a few of those in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf, Paul, and Richard. Thank you for your time.